Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slave service peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot, and today I would like to talk about all the banks are broke. As people who watch me regularly know, and a lot of other people out there know, all the banks are broke. You know who really knows that? The bankers. And that's been my mantra for a while, and I want to suggest that most of the banks in Europe and America and around the world are pretty much broke. And people say, how could that be? Look at all these huge profits. Look at all these huge bonuses. Look at these balance sheets. Look at all these portfolios. Look at all this investing. Well, it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all a house of cards. It's all a charade. It's all a fraud. And it's just a bunch of numbers getting pushed around and wealth created out of thin air. And it's all done with magic. And a good example of that is when you see behind the screen, you see what the magician is doing. And we're going to see that in a lot of big banks around Europe and America. But let's tell the story of one bank to see how this pattern unfolds. And we find out how the emperor has no clothes. And let's talk about Bankia in Spain. So this week they were completely nationalized, and a lot of interesting things happened when Bankia, one of the largest banks in Spain, was 100% nationalized, which means that the Spanish government and the Spanish taxpayers own Bankia, which at the present time is worth less than zero. And let's look at the pattern of how this all started. So of course Bankia is one of all hundreds of European banks that have not only taken secret bailouts over the last 4 years, but have also revealed that they are all interconnected with all the same bad investments and all the same liabilities and all the same toxic assets. And so they're all intertwined. And then more importantly, of course, they all passed all these stress tests. Remember all the Eurozone bank stress tests, one after another, one bank after another. And, we had hundreds of banks pass these stress tests with flying colors, much like the banks in the U.S. When they needed them to. And but by the time this last May rolled around, this was a month ago, of course Spain came and bailed out Bankia to the tune of 10 billion euros. 10 billion euros they certainly don't have, because not only is Bankia and all the banks broke, but their government's broke. And that's another story that's repeated around the globe. So so that was May 7th when they put $10 billion to bail out Bankia, and then by 2 days later, audits showed that Bankia was short 3.5 billion euros. So let me specify that you heard me right. They audited, so this was an official audit to show exactly what was on the books of Bankia. So remember this fact because it'll play in importantly later. So supposedly the bank was short only 3.5 billion euros. Which in the Spanish economy is deposits of up to 10% of Spanish GDP. So a day after that, by May 10th, Bankia is 45% nationalized by the Spanish government. And eventually 8 more banks would be nationalized, and one of which they tried to sell and they couldn't even give away for zero, just to get somebody to keep the institution in place. They couldn't even get somebody to take it for free. So that's how much their banks are worth, zero. And I wanted to lay out the story like this because look at it in a matter of years. We've seen complete shattering of the myth of what is exactly going on in European and particularly Spanish banks. And now we have in a several-day sequence, like everything that's happening in the Eurozone these days, several days the story dramatically changes. And, who can forget that Eurozone banks and the U.S. banks are completely interconnected, so this is very important to all Americans. So we have that sequence of events, and then Spain comes and asks for a 110 billion euro bailout from the Eurozone, and they want to get them to use the emergency fund. And of course, Citigroup analysts suggest that they probably need 350 billion euros to bail out their entire banking system, because the Spanish banks are loaded up with bad real estate. The entire real estate bubble in Spain has collapsed, and it makes the situation in the U.S. look pale in comparison. And their entire economy was based on housing construction and the boom in real estate. And that's completely bottomed out. So all these Spanish banks were stuck with all this toxic real estate, depressed in a complete deflationary spiral. And the other problem, of course, is all the other major banks across Europe invested in the same real estate market. Banks in Ireland, banks in Germany, banks in France, all over the Eurozone. So they're all exposed to these losses. And but let's get back to the sequence of events. So now we have a situation where a month later, Spain now bought out 100% of Bankia, and it is worth absolutely nothing. So this last week, Bankia was completely nationalized by the Spanish government, which means that they own it and the Spanish taxpayers own it. And as it turns out, the shareholders got completely wiped out. The entire board resigned, probably with fat pensions, I would imagine. But here's the bottom line. Here's what I've been driving at all along about all the banks being broke. So once Bankia was exposed and nationalized, it turns out they are 13 billion euros in the negative. They are worth 13 billion euros less than zero. So, their balance sheet probably looked fine. They looked at past all these stress tests, passed these audits, got some bailouts, and even with all that, even with all the money they got from the secret bailouts, even from all the money from the ECB, even from all the money trading back and forth with other banks and the governments, they are 13 billion euros negative. They are broke. They are bankrupt. All the banks are bankrupt. All the banks are broke. Look at JP Morgan. Look what's going on with them. So they have a rogue trader. He supposedly loses $2 billion in a trading position. Then it goes to $3 billion. Suggestions were it was $4 billion. Jamie Dimon admitted today that it's $5 billion. There's stories circulating around that it's as high as 9 or 10 billion. So, the fact is, there's a system that a friend and I use. A really very good friend of mine, JD. Hey, JD. He has a system called the JD factor, which takes any government or corporate number and increases it by tenfold. Mine is the Fox factor, which uses any government and corporate number, and I just double it. Sometimes his formula applies, sometimes mine applies. In this case, with JP Morgan, it started out as a Fox factor. The number was actually double what they said it was, and I was right. But now the number keeps going up. So now it's getting into the JD factor zone of 10 times that. And so by the time it's all over, we're going to find out that JP Morgan probably has closer to 30 or 40 billion dollars in exposure and losses. And we may never know, because behind the scenes they're going to do everything they can to prop this up. And of course, recently they've sold out some very lucrative performing assets in order to generate more cash. So anyway, so who knows? JP Morgan, suppose they fell and we got to see behind their books. What do you think would be there? Would it be another story just like Bankia? Wouldn't that be exciting? Ha ha ha. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.